It became part of the plot of his American novel One Fat Englishman, published in 1963, with the difference that its hero, Roger Mickeldene, has his script stolen before he is due to give a lecture, thus giving him an excuse to display all his talents for bad manners, arrogance, and anger by refusing to talk at all. Experience of this lecture circuit helped confirm Amos's views on university education. There were places of the highest quality, like Princeton or Yale, but at the other end of the range you got the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana. As Amos travelled the campuses, the likelihood that he would soon come to the conclusion that more will mean worse only grew stronger. Not that even Champaign-Urbana was all nightmare. On his second day there, the hangover Amos had built up the night before disappeared with his first lunchtime drink, and he experienced a state of dazzling euphoria, as has happened to me only 3 or 4 times in my life and never since. At lunch, Amos showed himself at the top of his form, and later overheard one faculty wife say to another, "Have you ever met a reserved Englishman?" A university that could produce this reaction to Amos's presence could surely not be bad all the way through. In Portugal, the Amos bullshit-detecting antennae had tuned themselves to tremble at any signs, in himself or anybody else, of submission to the lure of peasant mystique, and, worse still, of writing it up in overblown style, hiding a perverse ignorance beneath a froth of adjectives. But in America his antennae picked up a quite different sort of travelling ignoramus, what you might call the patronizing Brit. This is a man, Amos does not seem to have come across any woman similarly afflicted, who, while quite prepared to pay a fuddled respect to European civilizations because he has been told they are ancient and gracious, takes the opposite attitude in America, which he has been told is a naive and materialistic place, and many other patronizing things besides. Snobbery is stood on its head, but remains snobbery, even while upside down. A ripe example of this character type was Anthony Crosland, a rising young Labour MP and intellectual, late to hold a series of senior posts in Labour governments and dying in office in 1977, as Foreign Secretary. Amos had met him at a spectator party in 1957. Taking a liking to each other, they proceeded from there to an ad hoc party at Crosland's Kensington home at 19 The Boltons, where a quarrel broke out over the jazz records Amos had brought with him. In the version of this given in Crosland's biography by his wife Susan, the quarrel was over Amos's attempt to take charge of the Crosland gramophone and arrange his own records on its turntable. In Amos's version, Crosland was drunk in charge of the gramophone and heedlessly let the needle sweep across the surface of Amos's precious discs. Whatever the exact truth, it was essentially a dispute about the rights of the owner of the records against those of the owner of the gramophone. If Crosland had not been so big, Amos might have taken a swipe at him. Wisely, he decided to leave the party instead. On the face of it, Crosland and Amos should have made natural allies. Crosland was no hair-shirt socialist. Having fun was very much part of his agenda, and the brand of non-extreme social democracy he advocated in his highly influential book, The Future of Socialism, published in 1956, was of a kind that could be expected to appeal to the Amos of the late 1950s. But the trouble with Crosland, as Amos saw him, was that he was an upper-class snob, and none the less of one for being supposedly on the left, or when it came to America, for having an American girlfriend, later wife. Snobs, like Crosland, might be bright, but they could be just as prejudiced as anybody, and just as likely to shove their prejudices down other people's throats when they got the chance, as Crosland did when he became Education Secretary in the 1960s, deploying what an infuriated Amos called the Crosland Illiteracy Commandos throughout the schools and universities. In an Observer piece early in January 1960, Amos reported an exchange he had heard between an unnamed visiting Brit and an American student. "And what do you happen to be working on?" "Sir, I'm working on the Aeneid of Virgil." "Really? And tell me, what state do you come from?" "I'm a Texan, sir." "Really? Ha ha! I must say I find the notion of an Easterner working on Virgil interesting. A West Coaster working on Virgil would be amusing, but a Texan? It's simply grotesque." Amos called this a little true-life chiller, and added that the villain I record with a groan was a promising young Labour politician. He did not reveal that the villain in question was Crosland, but that's who it was. Amos came to think of meeting Britons in America as a major social hazard of being there. Already, after just a few weeks, he was telling Conquest that the only unpleasant people I've met have been English. The one variety of American who made Amos squirm almost as much as this kind of Briton was the American who fell for those Britons' line, who took British pretensions to maturity, ancientness, and tradition at face value, and were horrible Anglophiles, like the character Strode Atkins in One Fat Englishman. Americans like these were as capable of misreading England as Englishmen like Laurie Lee were capable of misreading Spain, and just as much to be deplored and despised in their way as Lee in his. Britons, wandering in a state of Crossland-like insensitivity through America, upset Amos on a number of counts. One was their habit of generalization. No Briton thought of himself in caricature form, dressed in a bearskin and a choker, and a frock coat and kilt, with a cup of tea in one hand, a pint of warm beer in the other, and a rolled umbrella over his arm. Yet they persisted in fixing Americans in a similarly outlandish stereotype, as being, for example, naive, or brash, or superficial, or woman-dominated, or shallowly bonhomous, or hypnotized by gadgetry, or only interested in a fast buck, and a fast car, and a fast martini jag. Well, yes, there was some of this materialism around, but where wasn't there? Then there was the British habit of carrying on like characters from the West End stage. One good reason for sending students across the Atlantic, Amos thought, was to let Americans know these were not the only kind of Briton. The self-conscious Britishness that lay behind the theatrical presentation was a post-war phenomenon, a horrible index of a nation in decline. A lot of it, of course, was to do with envy of American prosperity and power, especially anger at how Suez had exposed Britain's relative weakness. What particularly annoyed Amos when he got home was to hear about Britons who had been floated in free bourbon and not allowed to put their hand in their pocket for so much as a cigarette, and then went on about American immaturity. Or the British academics, themselves barely capable of construing a Shakespeare sonnet, who patted American heads for their Teutonic thoroughness, instead of being healthily scared by them. There was one compensation in contemplating all this British awfulness. It gave Amos the idea for One Fat Englishman, and its odious hero, Roger Mickeldene, who displays all kinds of contempt for America, on top of many personal horriblenesses of his own. He is fat, angry, gluttonous, drunken, vindictive, rude, aggressive, lecherous, arrogant, even to the Catholic God he occasionally makes his wishes known to. Apart from a fondness for snuff, Mickeldene has no resemblance to Amos, although Amos was beginning to develop a mild tendency to stoutness, which made him aware of what it might be like to be seriously fat. Outside every fat man, there was an even fatter man trying to close in, Amos wrote prophetically in the novel. And of course Mickledene's enthusiasm for women is no greater than Amos's. America, Amos found, made an excellent hunting ground, faculty wives and others turning out to be eager game. He really went to town there, Hilly recalls. Philip Larkin reported to Conquest in August 1959, after at last getting a letter from Amos. He seems to have spent his time drinking and fucking, as if this should surprise me. What Amos actually told Larkin was that for the first half of his trip he was boozing and working harder than I've ever done since the army, and that for the second half I was boozing and fucking harder than at any time at all. On the second count I found myself at it practically full time. One small incident in the novel was taken from Amos's amorous experience. When Mickeldene is making love to the wife of the horrible Anglophile Strode Atkins, in the course of a picnic, he notices that they are being observed by tortoises or turtles. The same thing happened to Amos. More than any particular person, however, Mickeldene is what any educated upper-class Englishman might turn out to be like if all his vices were given a free hand and all his virtues suppressed. An Anthony Crossland unbound, perhaps. His anti-Americanism takes the form of a generalized contempt, and being the egotist he is, even the mildest counter-dig at the British becomes a vile insult directed personally at him. Playing a game in which one person has to act out an adverb and the other to guess what it is, Mickeldene takes outraged offence when the woman he's after, Helene Bang, approaches a lamp standard like a guardsman and gives it a single peck on its shade, after being told to make love to it Britishly. "I'm afraid you'll have to excuse me from taking any further part in your sociological investigations," Mickeldene harumphs, and so breaks up the party. After various adventures, Helene finally eludes him, and he sets off for home, only to find the horrible Anglophile Atkins is travelling on the same liner. The two are thus condemned to spend the journey together, an ending surely devised by Amis as fit punishment for the two types of people he most disliked in America. Soon after he returned to Swansea, Amis tried to sum up his feelings about America in a letter to Larkin, to whom he had neglected to write all the time he was away. He had had a very fine time indeed, he said. Both Hilly and he wanted to go back again as soon as they could. If England had been blown up while they were away, Amis could happily have made his home in America. But not as things are. He had declined an offer of 2 more years at Princeton. Part of the reason was his wish to give his children an English education. Another part was his low literary output while in America. Swansea, being duller than Princeton, would at least let him get down to some sodding writing. 7 pages of novel, Take a Girl Like You, published in 1960, 3 poems, is not impressive for 10.5 months. Though he had also written the lectures that would become new maps of hell, that was not the work he thought he should be concentrating on. Amis had a lot of good things to say about Americans. They have more energy than we have, and they are better at enjoying themselves. They are not complacent or woman-dominated or death-wishing or insecure or naive, especially not that. Mind you have to go there to see it. I can't make anybody here believe it quite. The women, with a few shining exceptions, are less attractive than ours. Amis found it hard to come up with other reasons than its women for preferring Britain. The food tasted better, yes. But Americans had clams and soft-shell crabs. There was less advertising in Britain, yes. But there weren't so many nice things to buy. English was Amis's own tongue, but he had had no trouble talking it in America. The balance of advantages was difficult to strike. Going to the land of the free gives one a kind of restlessness which may prove hard to eradicate. It turned out not to be so hard after all. Staying in America for 2 years would probably have meant Amis staying there forever. He was 37, too old to become the citizen of another country, and perhaps too fond of his own to want to change, although residual leftiness made it difficult for him yet to admit love of country as a powerful enough motive to determinate his actions. America, however, had done its work on his politics too. He came to think of America as a critique in action of Britain. Whatever leftish orthodoxy required you to think of the American system, the palpable fact was that the system delivered in all kinds of ways. Efficiency, energy, conscientiousness, curiosity, and social freedom were all on Amis's list. He remained a Labour supporter, and was dismayed that the Tory party responsible for the Suez fiasco should have been returned to office in the 1959 election. But Amis's left-wing loyalties were weakening as his sense of patriotism grew stronger. 13. Leaving Swansea. By the beginning of the 1960s, Amis had made progress on all fronts except one, that of his own profession of university teacher. His achievement as a writer was steadily advancing and consolidating. Already he had behind him 4 novels, 3 volumes of poetry, a science fiction radio play, Touch and Go, about explorers on a hostile planet, snootily described in the Times of the 7th of November, 1957 as an adroit anecdote such as the 3rd program can afford to include without lowering of standards, and a pioneering book about science fiction, New Maps of Hell. He had pronounced controversially on political matters in his Fabian pamphlet, and written and broadcast numerous shorter pieces, learned, critical, and amusing, and sometimes all 3, as when, with his colleague David Sims, he contrived to smuggle a smutty line into the 1954 broadcast about Dr. Bowdler, famous for his cleaned-up family Shakespeare, and buried locally in Oystermouth churchyard. Dr. Bowdler wrote travel journals as well, and the Amis Sims script had a woman ask him, "Would you not devise some letters from France to cap your Dutch journal?" By the time the BBC Guardians of Taste saw the joke, it was too late to stop it going out. As an angry young man, too, Amis was celebrated beyond any mere lecturer of his generation, but in terms of his own profession, a mere lecturer is what he still was, earning the scale rate for his job as he had done since 1949. He had not climbed even a single rung on the career ladder to senior lecturer, let alone shinned up it as far as reader or professor, nor had he shifted sideways to another more prestigious university. Pleasant it may have been to work there, but it was not through Swansea's corridors that the great names of the English lit faculties strode. The money a shift in any direction might bring was not as important as it would once have been. Amos's university salary was of dwindling significance, besides what he earned from his writing, perhaps now only a third or a quarter of his total income. A less cautious man might already have abandoned the university life and set himself up as a writer full-time. Amos thought of doing that soon after the success of Lucky Jim. If he had, it would have been a ripe example of life imitating art, since such a leap in the dark was what Jim Dixon himself took when he gave up all prospect of a pensioned career in teaching for the insecurity of the job his patron Gore Urquhart offered him in London. But the fictional Jim was a bachelor, the real Amos a married man with 3 children, for whom prudence prevailed. If the right opportunity for a step forward within his profession should come up, though, Amos was in the right frame of mind to take it. As it happened, Peterhouse in Cambridge was thinking of appointing its first fellow in English, and as it further happened, Amos had established an indirect connection with the college through his friend George Gale, who had been an undergraduate there and kept in touch with some of its fellows, among them the historians Brian Wormold and Michael Oakeshott. Gale was a journalist, at that time with the Daily Express, later editor of The Spectator, later still a columnist on the Daily Mail. He was a little Toby Jug of a man, with a growly voice that gave a natural edge of aggression to his manner, an edge which served him equally well as a gruffly opinionated broadcaster and a customer in a pub trying to get some attention from an idle barman. Gale was also a staunch right-winger, which in the 50s Amos was not. Nevertheless, the two of them hit it off when they met at a party in the Spectator offices in Gower Street, sometime in the middle of that decade. Another connection emerged at that first encounter. Gale's wife, Pat, was a Swansea girl, and her mother and 2 sisters still lived in the city. There was therefore every reason why Amos and Gale should meet again, and they soon did in Amos's house at Glanmore Road, which Gale later pronounced as more awash with booze than any house he had ever been in. The friendship grew around common interests, such as being pro-drink and anti-bullshit, and was cemented by reciprocal visits, Amos to Gale's house in Staines, Gale to his in Swansea. Through Amos's friend Stuart Thomas, they also rented Dylan Thomas's boathouse at Logarn for holidays, where others sometimes joined them, including Wormold from Peterhouse. Stuart Thomas, though no relation of Dylan's, had been at school with him, and when the poet died, became solicitor to his estate. When the Peterhouse appointment came up, it was natural that Gale should mention it to Amos, or perhaps it was Pat who tipped off Hilly. However he learned about the vacancy, Amos let it be known he was interested. Brian Wormold, encouraged by Pat Gale, put Amos's name forward for the new post of Director of English Studies at a meeting of Peterhouse Fellows. Herbert Butterfield, the master, went round the table soliciting opinions. Ted Kenny, later Professor of Latin, remembers one fellow, a scientist, asking for a list of Amos's publications, and being somewhat taken aback to be told that Amos wrote novels rather than learned papers. Another fellow, David Knowles, responded with a peculiarly donnish fastidiousness. According to Kenny, he said, "Well, master, I must confess to being a little disappointed in Mr. Amos. Indeed, if I had known who he was, I shouldn't have known who he was, so to say." Knowles had started out as a monk at Downside before becoming a don, and eventually Regius Professor of Modern History at Cambridge. In spite of his and other mild reservations, Amos's election passed its final hurdle. The usual next step would have been to ask him to dinner, so that he could meet and be met by his prospective colleagues, but this formality seems to have been omitted. It may have been because there was not much doubt that he would be offered the post. At any rate, word got around that he was on his way to Cambridge. In March 1961, Philip Larkin mentioned it in a letter to Monica Jones. Isn't it a scream about Kingsley? A scream of laughter or rage, as the case may be? I must say I'm glad it's Cambridge and not Oxford who have done it. Queer college to have done it, though, all historians. But the protocol of election had still to be observed. In May, Amos wrote to a friend at the BBC, Marguerite Cutforth, wife of the broadcaster René, "You'll see that I don't mention my translation to Cambridge. This is because the final, utter, official rubber stamping hasn't taken place yet, and until it does, they've asked me to stay loftily silent on the subject in public." Soon afterwards, the last rubber stamping was completed, and Amos's election confirmed. He resigned from Swansea, took the family to Sitges in Spain for an August holiday, and returned to look for a house in Cambridge. Leaving Swansea was something of a wrench. Amos had grown very fond of Wales and the people he knew there. When he first went to Swansea in 1949, Amos brought with him only a caricature notion of the country, thinking of it as a rugger ground with Cadair Idris on one side and a spoil heap on the other, populated by pit-dirty miners who only stopped singing all through the night to bawl, "Look you to godness whatever," at one another, and subjected to continuous rain. About the rain, at least, he never found much need to change his mind. But about most other things he did. Swansea was English enough to be nothing like abroad, and more home than his caricature version of Wales allowed. Yet it was different all the same, and in ways Amos found almost entirely congenial. Chapel instead of church, and the absence of an upper class or even much of a middle class made the place far less socially divided than England. Good relations were easier to achieve, and social exchange with all kinds, from students to shopkeepers, more flexible and relaxed. Amos found the Welsh warmer, friendlier, affectionate towards children, in a style more like Italy or Spain than England. They could be excessively nosy, but contrary to myth, they were neither more nor less devious or dishonest than the English. Somehow, though, they managed to be less offensive when they set about cheating you or prying into your affairs. Wales had its own native hypocrisies and prejudices too, especially where women were concerned. When the wife of one of Amos's colleagues applied for a job in the college library, it was to her husband that the library's first inquiry was directed, to see if he approved. A wife's place was in the home, and to give a woman a job was to deprive a male breadwinner of the chance of it. Pub manners, too, were discriminatory in a distinctively Welsh way. Once after walking the dog on the shore of Swansea Bay, Amos took Hilly for a drink in the Woodman, ordering a pint of bitter for himself and a pint of shandy for her. Was the pint of shandy for a lady? Inquired the woman behind the bar. When Amos said it was, the landlady declared that her regulars did not like to see ladies drinking pints. Would 2 half-pints be all right instead? There was a bar in a hotel called the Three Lamps in Swansea, which Amos remembers showing off its upmarket status by serving drinks with cherries on sticks, and by not serving pints of beer even to men. It sold beer all right, but only in half-pint glasses. What would have been seen in England as the rather mean and narrow standards of the lower middle class generally prevailed, lightened by a Welsh talent for mildly hypocritical compromise. The more extreme forms of Welshness grated on Amos, but at that time did not much intrude. Sight of bilingual road signs, taxi, T-A-C-S-I, alongside taxi, could still be relied on to rouse him to weary disgust in the 1990s, but they were not yet to be seen in 1950s Swansea. Nationalism he regarded as unrepresentative of Welsh people, being largely the enthusiasm of a sect made up of clergymen, teachers, employees of BBC Wales, and such like untypical persons. Dylan Thomas did more to earn Amos's approval by saying "fuck Welsh nationalism," or words to that effect, in an interview, than by any other of his utterances. Thomas himself he regarded as a pernicious figure, a bad poet, whose regrettable popularity did lasting harm to both Wales and Welsh poetry, creating, as Amos wrote in his memoirs, a picture that was false, sentimentalizing, melodramatizing, sensationalizing, ingratiating. Although he thought Thomas an outstandingly unpleasant man, he had some sympathy for him as a failed poet. Thomas's own name for himself, the Rambo of Cymdoncyn Drive, was all too near the mark for comfort, since, like the real Rambo, Thomas was all but written out by the age of 19, an understandable reason for anyone to take to the bottle. But this did not excuse his overblown poetry and prose, nor his promotion of a false image of Wales, and Amos was to caricature Thomas's kind of Welsh windbaggery when he made Bryden, in his 1986 novel The Old Devils, resemble him in style not a little. There had been some unhappy times at Swansea too. Amos's mother had died in 1957 in circumstances that were peculiarly upsetting. The 3-year-old Sally Amos was staying at her grandparents' home in Berkhamsted when it happened. Grandfather William had scarcely left for work when his wife Peggy fell down in the bedroom while dressing, instantly dead from a stroke. Sally was left alone all day with her grandmother's body until William came home, and when she got back to Swansea, family friends noticed how anxious the experience had made her. If she saw her father asleep, friends noticed she would try to pry his eyes open for fear that he too had died. Sally had caused Amos and Hilly anxieties of their own the year before when she fell on her head in the garden and had to stay in hospital for weeks. Writing to Anthony Powell at the end of October, Amos said, "Actually, we have stopped worrying about her in all but a minimal sort of way, but that remains. You can imagine what a business it was at the time." Fortunately, there were no long-term effects. With his mother dead, Amos felt obliged to bring his father, who retired soon afterwards, to live with him in Swansea. Filial duty rather than personal pleasure was the motive, for his feelings towards his father had long been a compound of boredom and indifference. Besides, William Amos took up bedroom space, which meant that it was difficult to have guests to stay, unless the old boy could be got rid of. Amos wanted to invite Violet and Anthony Powell for a visit in 1958, before he set sail on the Queen Elizabeth in early September for his year at Princeton. "I'm still hoping to drag the pair of you over here for a weekend before we sail," he wrote to them in late July. "But the chances of getting my father out of the way, a provision that really gives sine qua non its full meaning, don't look too rosy at the moment." He added, "A wan smile briefly lit my features on finding that my father is sharing a cabin with 3 strangers." But a fortnight later, Amos sent another letter. "Alas, it looks as if my father, have I ever told you what I feel about him, is going to be firmly anchored here until we sail." William Amos continued to irritate his son when the family returned from America, where it was briefly thought he might remain with his sister Gladys, who by then lived in Washington with her second husband. Instead, William came back and found a job in London and a room in a small flat belonging to a friend of Kingsley's. By June 1960, the friend was getting restless with this arrangement, but didn't like to tell William Amos so to his face, preferring instead that Kingsley should deliver the bad news. This set Amos a very delicate problem of conscience, as he wrote to Powell. Might not William return to Swansea if told he was no longer welcome at the London flat? At the moment my friend's discomfort is torturing me frightfully, but I believe I can take it a little longer. In retrospect, Amos's Swansea years were to take on something of the glow of a golden age. The family was intact, the children growing, success accumulating and income increasing to the point where money was no longer a serious worry. Amos did not now have to ration his cigarette consumption, as did Lucky Jim, for financial reasons, though he began to make intermittent efforts to cut down for reasons of health, taking up snuff as a way of cutting down on cigarettes. Writing to David Sims' widow, Joyce, soon after her husband's death in 1989, Amos said, "It was all very happy, wasn't it, on the whole, and terrifically active. How we got through all the beach trips, Joe Bartley's thrashes and the rest of it, I can't imagine. Well, it was the best time of my life, and you and David probably did more than anyone else to make it so." In his memoirs, Amos said that he missed Swansea constantly, and often wished he'd never left. But he also recognized that the Swansea of the 1950s had vanished. By the 1990s, youth had gone, marriages were broken, children had grown up, old friends were dead. Amos kept in touch with Swansea and his friends there, though with a gap in the years when he was married to Elizabeth Jane Howard, she and Swansea seeming not to take to each other. He still contrives to spend a few weeks with Stuart and Eve Thomas in August and September, when the Garrick Club is closed for the summer holidays. But once he left, there was never any hope of recapturing the golden days, and so no point in regretting them. None of that, of course, was in Amos's mind when he left Swansea for Cambridge. In 1961, he was all optimism and expectation at what seemed a natural advance. Perhaps in another ancient university he could recapture the romantic excitement of his Oxford years, find a better class of student and a faculty of brilliant minds and literary enthusiasms, with a few drinking chums thrown in. He was quickly disillusioned. 14. Cambridge. Hilly found the 5 Amoses a place to live in, at the Mill House in West Ratting, a few miles from Cambridge, from where she drove the children to school and her husband into town as necessary. They stayed for only 2 months before moving into Cambridge itself, close to the new Churchill College, at 9 Madingley Road, a rather posh house, Amos called it, one in a line of ample bourgeois residences, the only one to have been demolished since then. It had a large garden, backing onto playing fields, with a lawn, elms, and rosebeds. There was a greenhouse and a shed big enough to accommodate Debbie, the new family donkey. But Amos very soon began to feel uneasy about life at this new university. They all talk too loud in Cambridge. It's an arrogance. They're so bad-mannered that you would almost think you were in Paris. The fact is that public schoolboys don't care." This was Amos talking to Quentin Crewe of the Daily Mail in January 1962, after only one term at Cambridge. What was it about the place that made him uncomfortable? There were little things. If you were walking down the street in Swansea, he told Crewe, and someone was coming towards you, then each person would sway a bit to the side so they missed one another. But not in Cambridge. Unless you get right out of the way, they bump into you. At Cambridge, the students put on an act to disguise their ignorance. Ask a student at Swansea about Thorstein Veblen, the American sociologist, and the student would say, "Who's he?" Whereas a Cambridge student would say, "Ah, yes," even though he knew no more about Veblen than the Swansea student. However, Amos allowed there was something to be said for the Cambridge man, who would probably go and look Veblen up, knowing he wouldn't get away with his evasion a second time. Then there was the playboy factor. The upper classes are more entrenched at Cambridge than you would think. Many of them are there to fool around. Nothing like that went on in Wales, of course. On the other hand, Welsh students were too likely to take the opposite extreme and think of their courses as little more than steps towards fulfilling their ambitions. But Amos liked this better than the fact that my students at Cambridge think it's slightly square to be enthusiastic. Summing up the differences between Swansea and Cambridge attitudes, Amos found all of them rather comic, but class certainly weighed more heavily at Cambridge. It took up a fatiguingly disproportionate amount of a young student's time, he told Crewe, and it infected his own subject. The view that culture is pall-mall is both prevalent and weakening. The class structure, he thought, was tattered, yet still in good enough shape to last probably his lifetime. The biggest threat he saw to it was the common market. If that came off, people would find out that class was not a law of nature, and this will be a real danger to those who own the class structure. Approval of the common market as an instrument of positive change rings quaintly 30 years on, when Amos has long been a stern opponent of all things European. The need to shake off the negative effects of class has, however, been a preoccupation of his all his life, especially the effects of class on literature, which tends always to turn it into the possession of a superior and exclusive minority intent on keeping the majority off their territory, as though literature were a private estate or a private pall-mall. And yet Amos acknowledged to Crewe that it was all more complicated in Cambridge than it had seemed in Swansea. Lucky Jim's targets had been obvious. The windmills to tilt at are bigger now, but more complex and elusive too, somehow. For in a sense, people made up class divisions as they went along. Rank pulling is in oneself, in the professor who is bumped into on the street. One example of this new class complexity was the way some dons tried to stand old class divisions on their head. Amos found his Cambridge colleagues were no longer exactly the upper-class port and walnut men he had known at Oxford. Now they were likely to be professionals from any class. But undergraduates were still drawn in disproportionate numbers from the public schools, as they are now, and colleges made intermittent efforts to shift the balance of their intake towards state school pupils, as they do today. Amos was once at a college meeting held to decide a scholarship award for which there were two candidates of more or less equal merit, as judged by exam results and interviews. But one was from a well-known public school, while the other was from a humble state-funded establishment. Someone proposed the latter candidate should get the award. At least that would dilute the public school dominance. There seems to have been relief round the table at finding a solution that was both simple and uplifting to what might otherwise have been vexingly tricky. Amos, however, asked the meeting to reconsider. Surely a chap's having parents who could afford to pay school fees should not be held against him. Who the fellows finally chose is now forgotten, but here was the Labour-voting anti-snob Amos intervening on behalf of the better-off classes in the name of fairness. Things were indeed more socially complex than they had once appeared to him to be. Amos hardly knew Cambridge when he arrived at Peterhouse. He had visited it only once before, in 1940, when he had unsuccessfully tried for a scholarship to St. Catherine's, and he remembered that experience so little that in 1961 he found he recognized nothing whatever about St. Catherine's when he went back to look it over. Memory and nostalgia were part of the problem Amos had with Cambridge. He hoped living there would be like living in the Oxford he had first known 20 years earlier, and that he would be able to recapture something of the pleasure and excitement Oxford had given him then and later. By the time he came to look back on his Swansea years, For his memoirs, he knew better than to think he could recapture past times. But when he went to Cambridge, he still thought he could relive something like his old Oxford experience. He was disappointed. His Cambridge turned out to be nothing like his Oxford, beginning with the town itself. Amos didn't feel at home in it. Its characteristic images, like King's College Chapel at dusk in a thin mist, he wrote a few years later, seemed cold and lonely, a setting more appropriate to an unhappy love affair than to the bustling exchange of ideas that is supposed to go on. He added, "Arrival at that curious railway station, with its endless single platform like something out of Kafka, or Kiriko, ought to tip off the sensitive." Peterhouse was the exception. He would have been happy with it, providing it could have been put on rollers and shifted elsewhere, along with the college members, the kitchen staff, and the gardens, to the Cotswolds or upstate New York. Amos's feelings about Cambridge society matched his feelings about the town. Each was as cold as the other. Cambridge he found inhospitable, despite the ceaseless ceremonial parade of hospitality. That was the trouble. It was all too formal. For Amos, the essence of the enjoyable social occasion has always been that it should be fluid, relaxed, casual. Drinking with friends in the pub or at a cocktail party is fine. So is going on to eat afterwards. Having friends round to drink at home is all right too, and even feeding them there. Though never more than 3 couples should be invited to sit down at table in your own home or anybody else's. Anything on a larger scale gets into formal dinner party territory, and is to be strictly avoided. Dinner parties inflict strangers on you, some of whom are sure to be disagreeable, while at the same time impossible to escape. If compelled to enter a roomful of strangers, they would all, in a perfect Amosian world, turn out to be easy to get on with Welsh people. But this was unlikely to happen in Cambridge. The dinner party, as Amos put it in his memoirs, forbids all the things that informal arrangements allow, such as fairly late arrival, early departure without causing a stir, fairly manifest drunkenness, cancellation on subcosmic excuse. That is, something less than grave illness or domestic tragedy. That is why the peak of social ease for Amos is a club like the Garrick, where members come and go as they please, eat and drink what and when they like, sit down with those people they find agreeable and steer clear of those they don't. He hated being forced to remain seated at the dinner table after the food had been consumed as a child, and he continued to hate all restraints on his social freedom for the rest of his life. If the common or garden domestic species of dinner party is bad, the college function is worse. A college feast at that time typically excluded women, compelled the men to dress up in the dinner jackets Amos hated, spun things out with toasts and other flummery. Although the food might be delicious and the wine excellent, there was sure to be too much of the first and not enough of the second. Besides, the hall in which the dinner was held was certain to be unheated and smoking forbidden until the whole assembly moved to another room for after-dinner drinks. These were first class, but etiquette required drink to be circulated in decanters, passed leftwards from diner to diner, and an adequate supply depended on others remembering to keep them moving. It is not difficult to imagine Amos keeping an anxious eye on this procedure, his face falling into scowls of dismay and despair when his preferred decanter got stuck in front of some thoughtless don or teetotal professor. And if by lucky chance one found a neighbour at dinner worth talking to, one was bound to be put next to someone else after the move to post-dinner drinks. This, at any rate, was how these festivities struck Amos, and it was to pass through his mind when he left Cambridge that burning his dinner jacket in King's Parade might be the most appropriate farewell gesture he could make. Better even than tearing up his notes on Jane Austen and dropping Coleridge's Biographia Literaria in the Cam. "I dislike the excessive formality of faculty life," he told The Times bluntly just before Christmas in 1962, when, in only his 4th term, he had already handed in his resignation from Peterhouse. "Too much dressing up and respectability. I do not like having to wait for a smoke after dinner until the port has gone round high table twice. Dining out in other colleges as a guest seems to me to involve an excessive amount of protocol," and he spoke of escaping from the stuffiness of Cambridge. Struggling as best he could through this unsympathetic social terrain, Amos finally reached his ultimate dinner party, the one which made him realize he could struggle no further. As he recalled in his memoirs, he found himself, on this clenching occasion, among unfamiliar guests at one end of a college high table. It happened to be his own Peterhouse on a bad night, but it could just as well have been any other college. For the first half-hour or so the conversation was all about the paintings, drawings, engravings, and other such that his neighbours had been buying. Since this was not an enthusiasm of Amos's, he said nothing. Noticing this, another guest tried to draw him into the conversation with, "And what is your particular, line of country in this, With grand guignol humility of tone and gesture, Amos wrote, I said, "I'm afraid I don't go in for any of that kind of thing." The other man said, Then he said, "I think that's a dreadful thing to say." Amos remained silent after that, wishing, for perhaps the 100th time since arriving in Cambridge, that he was back in a Swansea pub, like the Brinny Moor, with his old friends David Sims, Joe Bartley, and Willie Smith. From all such charges of stuffiness, Amos carefully excluded his own college then and later, though he was allocated some shitty rooms in which to teach, first in what had once been a kind of bridge connecting parts of the college, later in a building some way from the college proper in Trumpington Street. He always liked the place and the people, and continued to remember both with affection. "The atmosphere in Peterhouse has always been most friendly," he told the Times. "My fellow dons were relaxed, unmalicious, and never stooped to backbiting. I cannot say the same about the rest of the Cambridge academic world." This academic world was yet another side of Cambridge life he found himself thoroughly disliking. Amos had no university appointment. Under the double-barrelled Oxbridge system, which makes the colleges largely independent of the university, it was possible for him to be Director of English Studies at Peterhouse while not figuring at all on the strength of the university's English faculty. This spared him the need to give lectures. The only lectures he gave during his Cambridge years were to literary clubs or societies, and any direct involvement in the administration of his own subject, for which the one general meeting of the faculty he was invited to attend made him truly grateful. At the meeting, he wrote, he witnessed a first-rate clash of opposing juntas, perhaps staged expressly for my benefit. This sort of politicking within and between faculties, and probably in colleges too, though Amos found little or nothing of that in Peterhouse, seemed to him what interested his colleagues most. He had expected to find brighter, keener minds at Cambridge than at Swansea. After all, Cambridge was the top of the academic tree. Where were finer intellects to be found, if not here? "I sat back for a dose of original and well-grounded talk about English literature," he wrote a year after he left Cambridge, "but I did not get it. What, to his dismay, he got instead was talk about infra-faculty discord and personal quarrels, syllabus changes, the proportion of firsts to other classes, the attendance at old Joe Soap's lectures, etc. In other words, gossip, and of a pretty high order of bitchiness too. But not a word was ever uttered about, say, Donne, or Tennyson, or Traherne. Now and again in Swansea somebody would mention a real writer in ordinary conversation, and even if what was said was not especially profound, the fact of talking about it showed the speaker took some interest in his subject for its own sake, not simply as a vehicle for politics and intrigue. There was no evidence to be had of similar interest in Cambridge. At least none came Amos's way. One of the bitchiest of all remarks that did reach him was about himself, and it was reported to have been pronounced by Cambridge's leading literary critic of the day, Dr. F.R. Leavis. According to frequent and well-authenticated accounts poured into Amos's ear, the fellows of Downing College, where Leavis belonged, were discussing a problem. It might have been car parking, when somebody suggested following Peterhouse's example in solving it. Leavis is then alleged to have said, "Peterhouse can't expect to be taken seriously about anything, now that it's given a fellowship to a pornographer." Leavis did not, it seems, mention Amos by name, but nobody was in any doubt that that was who he meant. His shaft seemed to Amos not only bitchy, but wildly wide of the mark, since his novels were by most current standards uncommonly discreet and reticent about matters of sex. Deliberately so. Not out of prudishness, but because Amos has always believed it impossible to write in detail about what people do to each other in bed, without sounding laughable or absurd. Amos had once been a moderate admirer of Leavis's, and continued to admire a few of his pieces, particularly his essay on Othello, but he came to think that Leavis had done more harm than good to literature, though he did not get around to this judgment until he had left Cambridge. Perhaps Leavis's description of him as a pornographer helped colour his mature view. But Leavis's published comments on Amos were certainly not of a kind to make Amos look kindly on him. In a sentence which yoked Amos curiously together with Ernest Hemingway, Leavis loftily declared that a period when Hemingway could be accepted as a great writer and an Amis novel described as a serious study in amorality could only be one marked by a collapse of standards. In a footnote in his book on Dickens, Leavis contrasts the two writers, claiming that Dickens does not use his remarkable powers of ridicule and satire irresponsibly, perhaps the true sign of great art, while Amis did. Amis never met Leavis, though he passed him once in the street, Leavis dressed in his usual open-necked shirt. Perhaps if they had sat down together, they could have had that serious talk about literature which eluded Amis throughout his Cambridge days. Leavis might even have found Amis quite serious and well informed on the subject. Then again, he might not. As with Leavis, so with the rest of the English fraternity. Amis did not hit it off with any of them. Donald Davy of Caius College accused him of thinking he, Davy, was square, which Amis did think he was, though thinking somewhat better than that of his work. Donald Davy of Caius College accused him of thinking he, Davy, was square, which Amis did think he was, though thinking somewhat better than that of his work. George Steiner of Churchill College failed tests of possible friendship on 2 counts. First, though American by birth, he had acquired a heavy German-type accent, immersed himself in European culture, and was not afraid of making statements about the literature of most major European languages. This was bound to raise the Amis eyebrows, if not curl the Amis lip, since he is relentlessly sceptical of anybody's claim to understand literature in a foreign language, unless he has immersed himself in that tongue for many years. Steiner also failed another standard Amis test. He did not keep the drink flowing at dinner parties. Andrew Sinclair, the novelist, and Don, also at Churchill, fell at the drinks hurdle even more decisively, putting a seal on the improbability that he and Amis would ever become friends by turning up at the Merton Arms for a session, only to discover that he had no money about his person. In one way or another, all members of the English faculty that Amis came across failed to meet his standards of amiability. They were either unsympathetically straight-laced and mean, or too zealously embroiled in faculty politics, or they were both. Among fellow dons, he came to find some of the scientists more congenial. They liked music, and they liked contemporary writing, and they did not know or care about the English tripos. Failing to make friends in the obvious places, Amis looked elsewhere for companionship he could enjoy. George Gale was one person who, when available, could be counted on to fill that bill. During Amis's first summer at Cambridge, the two of them appeared at a party given by Maurice Cowling, who was to become a fellow of Peterhouse after Amis left, not only having had a drink or two, but dressed up in women's clothes as well. Their intention was to liven up, even shock what was intended to be a fairly formal event, and they succeeded. The following September they turned up tight again, this time at the front door of a Peterhouse flat where the Pennies lived. Gwyneth Penny was getting ready to give a lunch party when the doorbell rang at 5 minutes to 1, just when her guests were due. She opened the door to find Amis and Gale standing there, as she remembers them, swaying. Gale said they wanted to take a look round the flat to see if it would do for Amis to have as rooms after the Pennies left. They were due to move elsewhere soon. And in spite of her protests, they pushed their way in and had their look round. Only his considerable resources of charm allowed Amis to get away with this kind of drunken boorishness. Other friends visited too. Stuart and Eve Thomas, Anthony Powell, Philip Larkin, John Davenport, the very large and very drunken literary journalist, who aroused Amis's sense of pity by assuming that an invitation to spend the night meant that he was expected to sleep on the sofa, not in a proper bed in a real bedroom. Mervyn Brown, Amis's old tenor sax-playing Oxford friend, dropped in to see him while playing tennis in the area. He had won an Oxford Blue at the game, and found he was just in time to accompany Amis and Davenport to the pub. He clearly, or fairly clearly, remembers the three of them consuming 4 bottles of Beaujolais before returning to Amis's home for vodka soup. Not being a drinking man in the same league as the others, Brown took the precaution of eating his lunch before making another call the following summer, in time, fortunately for him, to catch Amis and Davenport stepping out of a cab bringing them home from the pub. The summer after that he called again, but this time Hilly was there alone. Amis was in Spain with Elizabeth Jane Howard. The one memorable encounter with a new face Amis had at Cambridge, the only one he thought worth writing up at the time, was with the Russian poet Yevgeny Yevtushenko, who came to do a poetry reading and spent several hours with Amis first. They got on surprisingly well, though there was something of a gap in understanding between them. What was Amos to make of such gnomic utterances that came to him through an interpreter like this? Hitler's cigarettes were the chimneys of the extermination camps. And there is an old Russian proverb which says that some kinds of simplicity are worse than theft. Amos coped as best he could, and was genuinely impressed with Yevtushenko's poetry reading, even though necessarily done in a foreign language. "He is the first completely good reason I have met with for liking the USSR," he wrote a few weeks afterwards. When Yevtushenko was nominated in 1968 for the Oxford Professorship of Poetry, however, Amos was prominent in opposing him on the grounds that, behind a facade of liberalism, Yevtushenko was no more than a publicist for the Soviet regime, which Amos by then so thoroughly detested. The new acquaintances Amos made, and most valued at Cambridge, were the undergraduates he taught. One of these was Richard Eyre, later to become director of the Royal National Theatre. Eyre had come up to Cambridge against his military family's wishes. His father, being violently anti-academic, preferred the university life to any other. Eyre was qualified in maths, physics, and chemistry, and had been accepted at Peterhouse to read science, but no objection was made when he proposed switching to English. On the contrary, having taken Amos on to teach that subject, Peterhouse had to provide him with a supply of undergraduates to justify his appointment. Eyre would do as well as anybody. His having no deep background in English literature or knowledge of the prevailing leaviest approach at Cambridge was no handicap with Amos. He was rather courteous and generous when Eyre read out his essays. Amos, Eyre soon discovered, was against adherence to any single approach or approved canon of critical thought, and thoroughly disliked the Leavisite habit of dividing writers into those who were acceptable and those who were not. Eyre remembers Amos sneering at Leavis. Whatever orthodoxy was in the ascendant, Amos was against it being swallowed whole. Eyre would produce an essay about, say, Twelfth Night, marinated in other critics' opinions. Having heard him through, Amos would insist on Eyre's own opinion. "Do you think it's any good?" he would ask. "Well, of course it must be. It was by Shakespeare." "Yes, but is it any good? I mean as a play. It says it's a comedy, fine, but does it have any decent jokes?" Amos wanted his students to read for themselves and make up their own minds. There was some feeling among Amos's Peterhouse colleagues that his methods were too abrasive, too irreverent for some of his students to handle. Eyre felt a bit like that at the time, but later changed his mind, coming to think that it was shocking but healthy for a young and impressionable man, ripe to become a fundamentalist in matters of literary taste, and ready to revere F.R. Leavis as the Ayatollah of Cambridge English. Amos would also take Eyre for a drink at Miller's Wine Parlour opposite King's College, where he introduced him to John Davenport. "They were the first two writers I'd ever met," Eyre says. "I thought I was in heaven." Inviting his undergraduates out for a drink, or to a party at his own home, seemed to Amos natural things to do. They were normal in Swansea, to the point where it would be abnormal in some pubs for there not to be circles of students and teachers drinking together, so why not Cambridge? But here it raised eyebrows, and worse. Amos found he was acquiring the reputation of being homosexual. Whatever his practice in youth, before girls became available, by this stage in his life any such leanings, as he later wrote, must operate at a level inaccessible to introspection. So rumours of his being queer were puzzling until he realized they must be prompted by his being seen in pubs with his undergraduate students, in those days inevitably at Peterhouse all male. That drinking with his students should appear perverse itself seemed perverse to Amos. He thought that contact outside the formal circumstances of lectures and tutorial were valuable because exchanges between student and teacher could take place on something nearer equal terms. Besides, shouldn't someone who taught young people actually enjoy their company? Here was something else Amos found wrong with Cambridge, the gap between the teacher and the taught. He made a habit of asking undergraduates what they felt the lack of most in Cambridge life, and they all told him the same: shortage of contact with senior members of the university. When he suggested the dons might be nervous of meetings beyond the odd official sherry party, the undergraduates said the dons could at least try. The confusion and apathy of many students, the lack of sense of direction, not to speak of more painful troubles, so often commented upon, all derive in part, I suggest, from failure to bridge the gap. Amos wrote this in 1964, well before the student unrest of the later 60s. But when these came, he was not altogether surprised, although he thought there were other factors involved, including too rapid expansion of the universities, bringing in too many young people unfitted for the academic life. He had already sensed an uneasiness in relations which, if not resolved, would inevitably become further soured and disintegrate in one way or another. When Amos left Cambridge, he gave up teaching for good, apart from a brief stint in Nashville, and so lost all contact with students. This was what he was to miss most about the academic world for the rest of his life. At university, he had two sorts of relationships with his pupils: formal, in the lecture or the tutorial, and informal, in the pub or at a party. The first was necessary, not only for the student, but for the teacher too. The teacher could try out his ideas on these occasions. But it was more than a matter of giving them a dry run in front of a captive audience. Teaching his ideas, Amos wrote, teaches him what these ideas are. When he gave up teaching, this stimulus was removed, leaving only the pub or the party. Such occasions, though, could only be a supplement to the formal side of teaching, and you could not, or Amos could not, get down to sustained and serious talk about writing with a glass in your hand. Almost all that was to remain of that kind of discussion was a chat now and then with Philip Larkin, or later with his son Martin. However, if it was teaching students that Amos was to miss most, it was also what drove him out of his academic profession and out of Cambridge. He came to the conclusion that he could be a writer or he could be a don, but he could not be both. This is one of those mysteries that baffle outsiders. How could anybody possibly claim that a mere dozen hours of tutorials a week could leave a man too exhausted to do anything else? To the outsider, it is not enough to say that a certain amount of mugging up had to be done as well. Aristotle, Racine, and Strindberg, two Amos' unwelcome intruders on an English course, as well as Volpone, The Anatomy of Melancholy, Bleak House, and Heart of Darkness. Also not much to Amos's taste, though at least written in English. Surely a Cambridge don could take all that in his stride. Some can, and do, and find time to write as well. Amos could not. To him, teaching had the same sort of training effect as appearing on television. Not as bad, perhaps, but bad enough. After his tutorial stints, he felt fit to listen to records, but not to write novels, which was what he wanted to do. Besides, he needed the money that writing brought in. The larger part of his income came from that source now, and he could not possibly maintain his family on his Peterhouse earnings alone, which were not topped up by any payments he would have got if he had been on the university's payroll as well. The burdens of teaching, social frigidity, and faculty politics would perhaps not by themselves have been enough to drive Amos out of Cambridge, but they combined to make him feel uncomfortable, and at the same time to frustrate his wish to write and make money by doing so. And Amos now accepted that these, rather than his academic career, were his priorities. By the beginning of his second Cambridge year, he was ready to make another move. But where? An idea had begun to take shape during the summer vacation when Amos was offered a commission from the American magazine Show to interview the poet Robert Graves, who lived in Majorca. Amos had first written to Graves in 1954, pointing out that in an article in Punch Graves had said that he wrote just 10 words a day, which, according to Amos's calculation, would give him only a 7,300-word novel every 2 years. "Must stop now and write my word for the day," Amos added. "I plan to bring out a Conte every 20 years. Graves acknowledged his postcard, and Amos took this as a cue for a proper fan letter. "I now have some excuse for saying what I have often wanted to say, that for my money you're the best poet now writing in English. I know you know that all poets like your verse best, after their own, of course, but I thought I'd just confirm it, from my own corner of the battlefield." In 1961, Amos was among the 123 MAs who nominated Graves for the Oxford Poetry Professorship, in succession to W.H. Auden, and in June that year, when Graves came over from Majorca to deliver the Cruian lecture, he lunched with Amos in Oxford. They got on well enough for Graves to be in receptive mood when the interview was proposed. Graves did not like journalists who used him to get a free holiday in Majorca, but he thought Amos was one of the few non-phonies, and said it would be fun if he came. Robert Graves put up Amos and his family for 9 days in August in the Posada, or guest house, on his property at Dea, a tiny fishing village where he had lived since 1929, with a 10-year break from 1936, forced on him by wars. Looking round, Amos observed that Majorca seemed comfortable, the climate reliable, the cost of living low, and the population scrupulously courteous. There was no politics, but lots of fruit, trees, wine, sea. When he got home, Amos wrote to Graves, saying that he had been fired by your example to attempt an 8 a.m. start to the writing day. But Amos had been fired by more than that. Whatever reservations he might have had about living abroad, Graves was visible proof that exile need be no handicap to serious work. A move to Majorca would create an opportunity for undisturbed writing in congenial and affordable surroundings, with at least one good writer for a neighbour. Amos made up his mind to rent a house in Majorca for a year, move the family there, and give exile a try. Exile was most often the resort of writers and artists who wanted to escape the English legal regime, which still made a crime out of homosexual behaviour, but nobody could accuse Graves of that. All in all, exile seemed a sound way out of Cambridge, and worth at least a year's trial. When he had made up his mind, Amos told the master of Peterhouse, Herbert Butterfield, "Sir, with great regret, I want to resign my fellowship at the college." "In heaven's name, why?" asked Butterfield. Amos gave a selective explanation about the writer's need for solitude and so forth. "Yes," Butterfield said, "romanticism, that's what they used to call it in my day. The belief that you can help yourself to become an artist, or be a better artist, by going somewhere remote or in foreign parts." Butterfield may have found this a quaint idea, but he did not try to stop Amos from leaving. If Amos did not care much for Cambridge, his feelings came to be reciprocated. At Peterhouse, Brian Wormold was particularly upset. He had invested much of his own credibility in putting Amos up for a fellowship, and now here was Amos planning to defect after barely 4 terms. Other men have no doubt left the university with as much relief as Amos did, but they have mostly been tactful enough to keep their dark opinions of it to themselves. Not Amos. In interviews and in articles he said what he thought, about both Cambridge and the whole expanding university system. Philip Larkin surely reflected the resentful feelings of the university professionals when he wrote to Robert Conquest about Amos's departure. "I think it would have been more graceful of Kay to glide out of Cambridge without all this public posturing. If he made a mistake in thinking he could write there, that's his fault, not anybody else's. No need to put them in the wrong. I can't imagine Majorca will be any better." 30 years later, Amos's abrasive remarks still rankled, especially in Cambridge. And if one were to wonder why it is that Amos has never received an honorary degree, while Larkin, for example, got 7, Amos's outspokenness about the universities is surely a part of the answer. 15. Elizabeth Jane Howard. Amos was due to depart at the end of the academic year, which meant that he would continue teaching at Peterhouse for 2 more terms after he had submitted his resignation. During the Easter vacation, he went with Hilly to Majorca to look for a house, leaving Graves's address at Dea with Conquest as a point of contact if he needed to get in touch. They found a house that suited their purposes at Solia, within easy reach of Graves, and arranged to rent it for a year at £9 a week, beginning in the autumn. But before Amos could leave Cambridge, even before he had offered his resignation from Peterhouse, he had embarked on an adventure which was to disrupt the whole project of moving to Majorca and destroy his marriage to Hilly. The adventure began with an invitation to the Cheltenham Literary Festival. There was nothing remarkable in such an invitation, though in the light of what was to follow, a serious novelist would surely have hesitated to issue the same invitation to one of his characters, for fear of being seen to decline into farce by signalling the next twist in his plot with a leering lack of subtlety, for the seminar in which Amos was asked to take part was on sex in literature. The idea of inviting Amos came originally from the Sunday Telegraph, which had put up £1,500 to sponsor a day's activities at the festival, and so acquired rights to determine that part of the programme. But it fell to the festival's artistic director that year, Elizabeth Jane Howard, to write a letter asking Amos to be one of the panel of 4. The seminar took place on the 4th of October 1962 in Cheltenham's Town Hall, before an audience of about 1,000 people. On the platform alongside Amos were 2 Americans and a Frenchman, with the Sunday Telegraph's editor, Donald McLaughlin, taking the chair. Accounts of the proceedings are sketchy. Amos remembers saying that Jane Austen did not write about sex, but wrote instead what he called pecuniary pornography. According to the Daily Express, he also declared that it was the novelist's duty not to be reticent about sex, but went on to add that sex scenes were difficult to handle properly, and that descriptions of physical lovemaking make me embarrassed, especially Lady Chatterley. This was, and is, the standard Amos view. Writers must not shirk sexual directness, but are well advised to avoid blow-by-blow detail. Romain Gary, the French writer and diplomat, took refuge in the ambivalent line that while he was dead against pornography, he wouldn't give any judge the power to draw the line. Joseph Heller, author of the then recently published and enormously successful novel Catch-22, a largely undeserved success according to Amis, offered the view that the makers of mink coats had corrupted more girls than any literature had done. Amis thought little better of the fourth member of the panel, Carson McCullers, author of The Heart is a Lonely Hunter, among others, whom he had already met in New York. She gave it as her somewhat question-begging opinion that, so long as a book is true and beautiful, it could not be pornographic. This was routine stuff, and the seminar appears to have been a fairly lackluster event. According to Peregrine Worsthorne, then as now a journalist with the Telegraph and among the seminar audience, it suffered from the chairmanship of his editor, who didn't know much about literature, nor much about sex either, and also from Carson McCullers being drunk. Amis remembers Heller livening things up a bit by responding to someone in the audience who wanted to know why sex always seemed more burden than pleasure in fiction. "They had a hell of a good time in my book," said Heller. But it was away from the formal proceedings that Amis's adventure began, when he was introduced to the artistic director Elizabeth Jane Howard, always to be known by her middle name Jane. Had he been invited in any other year, he would have missed her, for she was to be the director for 1962 only. She brightened things up a bit by spending £100 on fireworks, and claims her year was a rare one, in which the festival turned into profit. But the pay was just £300 for a job that took 8 months' work, not enough money to encourage a woman with a living to earn to take it on a second time round. She and Amis had run into each other a few times before, but only by chance, at television studios, where both happened to be making appearances, and once in the street when Amis came across his old Oxford friend Kenneth Tynan, with her on his arm. Amis was aware of her existence and her attractiveness, but had not yet taken sufficient interest in her to go so far as to read even one of the novels for which she was already well known. What happened when they met at Cheltenham is best described in Amis's own words. "I sort of threw a pass at Jane, which was sort of accepted." This was not unusual behaviour for him. He was then, as he puts it, what I always was, on the lookout for a good time. Amis was immediately attracted to Jane, and she to him, but he had nothing more in mind than a possible fling of no greater consequence than any other. As Hilly was with him, nothing could in any case develop there and then. Being familiar by now with his enthusiasms for women, Hilly noticed at once that there was something in the air between her husband and Jane. She thought Jane was tossing her hair at him in a fairly blatant way. Still, though there might be another affair in the making for her to put up with, Hilly could not then have imagined it would go further than the others, any more than did her husband. Elizabeth Jane Howard was undoubtedly something of a prize for a man on the lookout for a good time. Born a year after Amis, she was beautiful still at 39, with long, thick blonde hair and attractively high cheekbones. When Evelyn Waugh insisted that he would only be interviewed for television by a beautiful young lady, she fitted the bill perfectly. She was talented, too, already the author of 3 highly praised novels, and she was socially well connected. Since people look for easily understood explanations, this combination was what most who knew Amis settled for when they later tried to account for his going off with Jane. Her glamour, a compelling mixture of beauty, talent, and class, was thought to have been simply irresistible to the lower middle-class Amis. It was a snob thing, in one view, and that view came to be widely held by Amis's friends. As often, the reality was more complicated. For one thing, Jane's background was not aristocratic, but rather, if one is looking for exactness among the intricate tracery of English class distinctions, well-off middle class. Her grandfather had started a timber business, Howard Brothers, which survived through 4 generations until it finally went broke in the 1980s. Grandfather bought a London house for his 3 sons to share, which meant that when Jane was a child there were a dozen or so cousins about in the school holidays, as well as her 2 younger brothers. The year before she was born, her mother, Catherine, had given birth to a daughter who died. Jane came to believe that her mother disliked her, preferring her brothers to herself, and later resenting the fact that Jane was able to pursue a career of her own, as well as marry and have a child. Catherine had had to give up her own career as a dancer when she married. Her husband insisted, as it was perhaps to be expected he would. The rule which then prevailed was that wives did not work. In this at least the Amis and Howard families resembled each other at their respective points either end of the middle-class spectrum. Neither mother had a job or career, though this does not appear to have troubled Peggy Amis as it did Catherine Howard. Since women were not expected to work, it followed that there was no need to educate them very rigorously either. Jane went to school for only 2 terms. The rest of her education was undertaken by a governess, Miss Cobham, who had also undertaken her mother's instruction when she was a child. Jane remembers Miss Cobham as very old, as well as being the ugliest woman in the world. Yet she was not stupid, having written books on philosophy and mathematics, though her teaching curriculum was eccentric. Jane learned Greek and Latin, for example, but no French. With so many brothers and cousins around, she did not miss the social contact that school would have provided, but later she came to regret her lack of a longer, more formal education. She read a lot for herself, but understood only about 1/3 of what she read. School lessons ended once and for all when she was 16, and university was out of the question. Like work, it was not something gone in for by young women like herself. Besides, the Second World War had begun. When she was 19, in 1942, Jane married Peter Scott, son of the celebrated national hero Captain Robert Falcon Scott of the Antarctic, and later famous in his own right as a naturalist and painter, and conserver of birds. Of course, Jane thought she was in love with this man 14 years her senior, but later she believed it was more the case that she had married the first man who told her she was attractive. Perhaps, too, she wanted to escape from a loveless home — her parents were by now divorced and her father remarried — into one where she could hope to be loved. From Scott's side, there was no doubt attraction too, but also a wish to have a child in these dangerous times before it was too late. He fought in destroyers through the Battle of the Atlantic, was mentioned in dispatches 3 times, and won the Distinguished Service Cross twice. His own mother was anxious that he should become a father, and in this the marriage did not let him down, Jane soon bearing him a daughter, Nicola. Jane's youth and inexperience were put under extra strain by wartime conditions. She worried about her husband whenever he was at sea, and found herself staying much of the time alone in hotels, sometimes the only woman for miles around among thousands of servicemen. If there had been no war, she might never have married Scott. As it was, the marriage only survived a few post-war years. When Jane finally decided that her husband was more interested in natural life than in people, even his wife and daughter, she bolted, as she was to do from her second and third husbands too. Bolter is the word she uses to describe herself, meaning that when she can put up with a relationship no longer, she decamps, with little or no notice served on her partner. In wartime conditions, the middle-class proprieties were set aside. Like everybody else, Jane worked for a living then, and was to do so for the rest of her life. Before settling to become a writer, she went from job to job. Through the years, she was variously a model, a publisher's reader, a newsreader on the BBC, and in 1947, secretary to the Inland Waterways Association. Then she turned to writing, and her first novel, The Beautiful Visit, was published in 1950, winning the John Llewellyn Rhys Memorial Prize. Being highly attractive, she was not short of offers from men when she and Scott parted, including offers of marriage. At first, she was more inclined to accept a proposal to make love than to marry, finding the men who wanted to become her husband unsuitable, and being reluctant to take a second plunge into marriage too soon after the failure of her first. In time, she changed her mind. She became tired of men wanting no more than to go to bed with her when they had known her only half an hour, and she wanted more children. Marriage was the best way of avoiding the first and achieving the second. But her second husband, whom she married in 1959, 8 years after her divorce from Scott, turned out even less of a success than her first. James Douglas Henry, an Australian broadcaster, was eager enough to make love to her before their wedding, but stopped doing so afterwards. Jane came to think that she had been deceived by his charm and cleverness into failing to realize that he was only interested in her money and connections. It was a measure of the relative degree of failure in her first 2 marriages that while she maintained amiable relations with Scott, she preferred to draw a veil over her time with Douglas Henry, and never mention him at all. Amos only ever caught sight of him once, from the rear, interviewing someone on television. When Amos came into Jane's life in 1962, she had bolted for a second time. Unable to pursue matters with Jane at Cheltenham, Amos took advantage of his trips to London to pursue her there instead. This was how he'd conducted his affairs in his Swansea days. But this time he allowed things to go further. As the months passed, the intensity of his feelings deepened. he enjoyed Jane's company more and more in and out of bed. Still, though this may have been a more compelling affair than others, he had no thought-out intention of turning it into something more than an affair. He tried to keep his usual veil of discretion drawn. However, not for the first time a flaw developed in his security system. Hilly discovered a compromising letter in his jacket pocket. In the past, and with other women, that might have been enough to end the affair, or at least force Amos into taking greater care not to leave clues about what he was up to lying around for his wife to come across. Now, though, there were to be no promises of better behavior. On the contrary, Amos announced that come the summer he intended to go to Spain for 3 weeks, and to take Jane with him. Meanwhile, ordinary life continued, more or less. In the early summer, Amos and Hilly went with 2 other couples to a science fiction film festival at Trieste. The other couples were the science fiction writers Brian Aldiss and Harry Harrison, plus Aldiss's wife-to-be Margaret and Harrison's wife Joan. Amos and Hilly joined their ranks as a consequence of his pioneering study of the science fiction genre, New Maps of Hell. One day, the 6 of them slipped across the Yugoslav border to Koper, formerly Capodistria, where, after a good lunch, all 6 went down to the beach. Amos stripped off and fell asleep on his face in the sunshine. Overwhelmed with misery at the latest evidence of his infidelity, Hilly seized the lipstick from her bag, and on his bare back she wrote, "One Fat Englishman," the title of the book he was working on. Underneath she wrote, "I fuck anything." Amos had never before been so blatant about his infidelity. He had tried to avoid Hilly finding out about his women, and if she did, to make as little of it as he possibly could, to brush it aside as unimportant. Nor did he make a great fuss about Hilly's own affairs. This was part of the understanding that kept their half-open marriage going, and although their marriage had also been subjected to the inevitable wear and tear of the years, juggling budgets, managing 3 children, diminishing sexual excitement, Amos still loved his wife and children, and still wanted very much to keep the family intact. He liked what was familiar as well as enjoying the thrill of what was different, and to a man of his anxious temperament, the disruption involved in separation or divorce was a horror to be avoided. There was a sense, too, in which a holiday with Jane could be seen as no great break with the past. Hilly knew about the affair, after all. What was so very different about making it semi-official for a few weeks on the understanding, which Amos willingly gave, that he would return to the fold when the weeks were over? This was an adjustment to previous behavior, not a radical departure from old ways. Or so Amos persuaded himself. In this mood, he saw no reason why he should not go away with Jane, and no reason why he should not come back to Hilly either. If this was his strategy, Amos might have been more tactful in his tactics. He left Cambridge for Jane on the 21st of July, Hilly's birthday, and on their bed he left behind, as a birthday present, a black baby doll-style nightie, which, to make matters worse, Hilly suspected had been chosen for her by Jane. Amos spent a night or 2 in London with Jane, and then set off for Citez, where he had taken the family for holidays before. For the rest of their 3 weeks, he and Jane read, drank, ate, made love, though Amos was no more keen than he ever was on swimming or sitting in the sun and getting tanned, which Jane loved. Wind of their whereabouts had somehow reached Fleet Street, and a reporter from the Daily Express came sniffing round their hotel. Luckily, a sympathetic proprietor put him off the track, moving Amos and Jane to another set of rooms to make doubly sure. Now, for the first time, Amos read one of Jane's novels, The Sea Change, taking 2 days on the beach to go through it. When he was finished, he gave his verdict. It was good, and he had enjoyed it. This was just as well. For a man as much given as Amos to speaking his mind about literature in the most categorical terms, it would have been impossible for him to have had a long-term relationship with a woman novelist whose work he could not respect. Yet Amos still did not anticipate having to sustain a relationship with Jane. His plan was to return to Cambridge, then take the whole family off to Majorca in time to get the children settled in and ready to start at the international school at Palma for the Christmas term. The first part of this plan Amos duly executed. He went back to Cambridge, but there he found the house at Madingley Road empty. There was no note, but he soon realized that Hilly had forced the issue. From friends he learned that she had gone off to Majorca, taking the children with her to the house Amos had rented at Solia. Although Amos was surprised that she had gone, he was not surprised that, once she had decided to go, she would have chosen Majorca as refuge. His response was to get straight back on the train to London and head for Jane's flat in Maida Vale. Hilly and Amos were never to live together again as husband and wife. It may be that their marriage unravelled more by miscalculation than by plan, certainly with no deliberate intention that it should on Amos's side. Perhaps, he thought, Hilly had gone off to Majorca as a way of calling his bluff, in the hope that he would rush after her full of contrition and eager to renounce Jane. If so, she was mistaken. Amos took the line of least resistance. He had hoped to return to the bosom of his family, but now he had another bosom to return to, Jane's. With her, he anticipated, there would be warmth and uncomplicated acceptance. There would be no rows to be gone through, no difficult reconciliations. Soon after Amos moved into Jane's flat, they decided to move out and rent another flat, where for a while they could be on their own. Jane shared her flat in Blomfield Road with her brother Colin, and there was always the possibility that he and Amos might not get on. The two had met at Cheltenham, and they were later to find that they could live in the same household perfectly well. For the time being, though, it seemed sensible for Amos and Jane to try out their new life together alone. They found a flat in Knightsbridge, in Basil Mansions, near Harrods, and moved in. In Majorca, meanwhile, the three children were growing unhappy. They began to pine for their father. If he could not be there with them, they wanted to hear from him at least. They took to going to the road at the end of the garden after breakfast, to wait for the postman to arrive on his motorbike. Occasionally he brought with him what they hoped for, a card from Amos. But they wanted more than that, and in the middle of November Hilly put 15-year-old Philip and 14-year-old Martin onto a plane for London, giving them Amos's address in Basil Mansions, and telling them to head there from Heathrow. The plane was late, and it was around 11 at night when the two boys rang the bell at Amos and Jane's flat. Their father opened the door in his pyjamas, seemingly unsure how to handle their sudden appearance. He had issued a general invitation for them to come and see him, but he was not expecting them to show up at that precise moment, and was uncertain how much they knew about what was going on. "You know I'm not alone," he said, and Jane loomed up dramatically in the background, wearing a white toweling robe to prove it. They ate bacon and eggs, and the boys tried to play it cool, as if meeting their father's new girlfriend was an everyday thing for them to be doing. Jane took care to see they had a good time for the few days they were in London, and Amos settled down with them for a couple of lengthy afternoon chats. Philip impressed his younger brother by calling his father a cunt during one of these, but it became clear to them that their father was going to stay with Jane, and not join the family in Majorca. One other event during the boys' brief stay before they flew back to start the school term in Palma stayed in everybody's mind. George Gale had come for dinner, and while they were having pre-dinner drinks, Amos took a telephone call from a journalist, Quentin Crewe. "What?" the others heard Amos shout incredulously. When he repeated what Crewe had told him, Gale promptly left for his newspaper office. This was how they all learned that President Kennedy had been shot on the 22nd of November 1963. If Amos's marriage to Hilly broke up through accident and miscalculation, like a ship in a sudden storm, the rock on which it came to pieces was solid enough, and had been a lurking threat for years. This rock was a fundamental difference of view between Amos and Hilly about married life. He thought he should feel free to have affairs, and she did not, in spite of her own. Perhaps their attitudes were ultimately irreconcilable, but events and circumstances played their part. If Jane had not been without a partner in the 1 year she directed the Cheltenham Festival, if Amos had not been invited to take part in a seminar that year, if he had not been at that time fed up with his Don's life and anxious to be on the move, if Hilly had not reacted to his brazen Spanish jaunt with Jane by rushing off to Majorca with the children, if Amos had followed Hilly to Majorca. Later in life, Amos was to speculate on how events might have worked out if each person in this little drama had played his or her hand differently. But it may have been written in their characters that, given the circumstances, each one should have behaved as he or she did. And given those characters, Amos's appetite for a good time with women, for instance, patching up the marriage might only have kept it temporarily together. If the break-up had not come then, it might have come later. If not over Jane, then over somebody else. These can only be speculations, as fruitless in the end as wondering how Amos's life might have been different if he had stayed in Swansea, or stuck to Cambridge. What happened was what happened, although years afterwards Amos was bitterly to regret that he himself did not play his hand otherwise. In his fourth novel, Take a Girl Like You, Amos has described something very like this clash of values between himself and Hilly. Patrick Standish is on the lookout at all times for girls to go to bed with. Jenny Bunn is on the lookout too, but for someone to love. who will love her in return. Patrick is modern, knowing, devious. Jenny is old-fashioned, naive, but sure of what she wants. She falls in love with Patrick, but doesn't want him on his terms, which include sex before marriage. "It's just your training," Patrick tells her. "Maybe it is, but that doesn't make any odds to me," she replies. Eventually he forces himself on her during a drunken party. Afterwards they are reconciled and plan a life together, but she knows it will not be what she had hoped. Patrick promises he will change, but she hardly believes him. "You know, Patrick Standish, I should never really have met you," Jenny says, "or I should have got rid of you while I still had the chance." Given the similar differences in values between herself and Amy's, Hilly might have said or thought the same. Take a Girl Like You was published in 1960, and it can be read as a remarkably prescient vision of the sexual turmoil that was to break out in the decade which has just begun. But it can also be read as an account of the differences between Amos and Hilly. Amos might have been on Patrick's side in the argument over sex, but he knew there was something to respect in the argument on the other side too. Patrick tells Jenny that what has happened to her was bound to, you know, darling, with a girl like you. Jenny thinks he may be right, though she adds, "But I can't help feeling it's rather a pity." A part of Amos felt the same. American friends of his thought the book was a love letter from him to Hilly, and Amos later thought there was a good deal in that. Certainly Hilly continued to keep a powerful hold on Amos's imagination. There is at least a trace of her in all the nice, attractive girls in his fiction, from Christine in Lucky Jim onwards. The traces Jane left were to be very different. Amos did not plan to leave Hilly and go off with Jane. Rather, he stumbled from one to the other at a time in his life when he was ripe for change and ready to make a move. But once the move was made, he could see few reasons for regret. Jane was glamorous, intelligent, sexy, and a writer whom he could respect. She paid Amos a lot of attention, which he enjoyed. She introduced him to new places and new people. She talked to him in his own terms, as one writer to another, in a way that Hilly had never been able or much wanted to do. For Amos and Jane, these early years were happy, romantic, a new grand passion, and they slipped easily from living together into marriage when Amos's divorce came through in 1965. After their first few weeks in Basil Mansions, they returned to Jane's flat at 16 Blomfield Road, and her brother Colin, who designed and built sound systems, and had been known since school days as Monkey. Amos liked and got on with him, and was happy that he should be one of the household. Others were to come and go. Throughout their life together, Jane and Amos were rarely alone in their own home. Colin stayed with them almost as long as their marriage lasted. He was joined by Sargie Mann, a jazz musician and painter friend of his, who moved in when Amos and Jane went away to Nashville in 1967, and stayed for 8 years. Amos's boys Philip and Martin were in residence through most of their teens, while Sally came for holidays. Jane's mother Catherine lived with them for 3 years until she died. Peregrine Worsthorne stayed for 6 months when his marriage went through a rocky phase, and there were often parties or weekend guests. With his long-standing fears of solitude and his intense liking for company, big households like this suited Amos well. They were reassuring and protective. If Jane went away, Amos was not left on his own overnight, with all the potential for anxiety and panic that would mean. And if he wanted a drink and a chat, he didn't even have to go as far as the pub to get them. If things got too much, he could always escape into the privacy of his study. There was to be a literary dividend, too. The ménage of himself and Jane, Man and Monkey, and Jane's mother presented him with the central situation for his 1974 novel Ending Up, which is about 5 people living together in the same house, with the difference that in the novel all 5 are old, and in various ways at odds with each other. The Amos household was younger and calmer. These arrangements may have suited Amos, but they may also have worked against the long-term success of his relationship with Jane. She at any rate came to think so. Both had passed 40 when they got together, and as a couple in middle age they should, she believed, have had more time on their own. Martin observed from the sidelines that when they had been on a trip by themselves they came back fortified by the experience. For the first years, though, the size of their household did not stop Amos and Jane from being happy in a passionate way. It did, however, prompt them to look for a larger establishment than Jane's flat, which was on 2 floors with only 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a drawing room and a dining room, as well as a garden at the rear. By the end of 1964, Jane, Amos and Monkey were living in a flat at Keats Grove in Hampstead. Very small, Amos wrote to Conquest on New Year's Eve, and most of the time about a millimetre thick in coal dust. To keep it warm, and thick in coal dust, I have to go down and up 5 flights of stairs, bearing first an empty, then a full coal bucket, or hod, as I believe they call the type in question. Keats Grove was a stopgap, while a house at 108 Maida Vale, on which they had acquired a 10-year lease for £2,000, was being got ready. It had a letterbox, but practically fuck all else yet, Amos said in his letter to Conquest. But within a couple of months, Amos, Jane and Monkey were installed at their new address. Amos had changed more in his life than his partner. He had left Cambridge as well as Hilly, and so given up the teaching career that had paid at least his bread-and-butter bills since 1949. Now he had to depend on his writing to pay all his bills, and he had to devise a writer's way of life to replace the round of lectures and tutorials and administrative chores that had filled up much of his day at Swansea and Cambridge. For a man of Amos's temperament, this meant creating a regular routine, which had to be stuck to no matter what. A shattering hangover, for instance.